Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Nazif Shahrani, to discuss the U.S. withdrawal and war in Afghanistan and some background to the conditions in Afghanistan. Dr. Shahrani is from Indiana University. He got his Ph.D. in anthropology at the University of Washington. He's now a professor of anthropology. He's researched Islamic movements, identity politics in failed and failing nation states, and looks broadly at the political ecology of states and society. He's had dozens of publications, written extensively on Afghanistan and Central Asia and the Middle East. Today we want to begin our conversation on Afghanistan because it has been in the news recently with the withdrawal of U.S. troops in August. And so the question here is 2,400 U.S. deaths, 100,000 Afghani deaths, some 6 million refugees that have been refugees for the last 10 years or so, but the focus of the media has been on those trying to get on the planes, trying to get out of Afghanistan immediately. My broad question for you, and I know this would take some time to fill us in completely, but how should we assess the U.S. war and then the U.S. withdrawal most recently in Afghanistan?
In my view, I think this was a war that should not have lasted as long as it did. We withdrew from Afghanistan 20 years too late. It should have ended after the first 2-3 months, when we had only about 200 to 300 boots on the ground, and much of the war was fought from the air, and the Taliban were ousted without any problem with local uprising who collaborated with the Americans and got the bombs out of the country. At that point, I think America should have just withdrawn and focused on helping build a state in Afghanistan that had fallen apart, and invested in infrastructure and good governance. Instead, we went into continuing the war, mostly counterinsurgency war, and sometimes shifting from counterinsurgency into counterterrorism, and occasionally nodding at the notion of nation building, while in fact we didn't do those things, or if we did them, did not do them very well.
You said nation building, and some would understand that the U.S. has invested millions of dollars in schools and universities, in broadly said infrastructure for nutrition and the rest. So did that not occur, or did it not occur under the right conditions or with the right leadership? What was, how did the bottom fall out of that?
We, on paper, invested huge amounts of our tax dollars in Afghanistan. Nobody can deny that. The government's own statistics show somewhere around $80 billion spending on building the military, just the security forces in Afghanistan, and probably close to about $130 billion on other humanitarian assistance, some of which may have been simply feeding people and so on, but others have been spent on road construction, a lot of which was for the use of the military, but the people in the country benefited from that. Nobody can doubt that. And certainly there have been plenty of schools built, but a lot of them are ghost schools, because the partners that the government of the United States chose in Afghanistan were, for the most part, corrupt, and people who were opportunists, who essentially were there to make money rather than to serve their own people. So in the educational system, for example, whatever money was given, they showed on paper that there were schools, teachers, and students and so forth. In fact, when it was closely looked at, they just didn't exist. They existed on paper.
The school was there, the teachers were there, the expense was there, but no instruction was taking place.
And no school was there.
No school was
No school was there, no students were there, no teachers were there. But money for the school, for the teachers, and for students were pocketed by somebody in the Ministry of Education. The same thing happened on the police and military forces. We, on the paper, supported at the tune of $5 billion a year, a force of 350,000 security personnel. And again, a lot of these were ghosts. They did not exist, but the money for them were taken and pocketed by somebody. The problem was not...
I'm sorry to interrupt. You're able to identify, you're able to find the evidence for this and explain this. Why couldn't U.S. government officials know this? Or did they know it and look the other way?
I think they knew very well, and they did not want to acknowledge it because there's money had to be spent. It was allocated and it had to be spent, and they spent it. I tell you something that I have personally witnessed. A few years back, I was in Afghanistan, and there was a presentation by a general, a retired general now, who was also in the Trump administration, the security advisor to the president. And he is a very smart man, has a Ph.D. in history, who is also a general, and from a very credible university. He was the head of the transparency office in Kabul. His job was to see how the money is spent and to report. He knew every crook that you could imagine. He gave his presentation at the American University of Afghanistan in Kabul. And I was there. I specifically wanted to go and hear him. He spoke so eloquently, so clearly, that I was sitting there and wondering, if you know this much, he didn't name names, but the people who knew whom he was talking about. So if you are head of the transparency office of the United States government in Kabul, and you know all of this, why aren't you doing something about it? And nothing was done. And he is on television quite regularly these days, as an expert on Afghanistan and talking about this. So I think the question was never not knowing. You know, a lot of people assume that the reason why our foreign policy is botched in international arena is because we don't know enough.
Lack of intelligence.
Yeah, we don't know enough.
Yeah.
Only if we knew. I'm here to tell you that is not the case. It's rarely ever the case. The foreign policy of the United States is never decided on the basis of knowledge and analysis. It's always made up on the basis of interest. They often very nicely label that national interest, but we know it is not national. It's not your interest. It's not my interest. It's not everyone else's interest who fund the government. It's the interest of the few people and few companies.
Yeah, I would think that the people that make the tanks or make the roads or make the weapons are more than happy however the money's spent, because the things are produced, they're sent away, and they get paid.
Yes.
And I would also think that the Afghanis have to know. What is the consequence of, let's just say, the last 40 years of war in Afghanistan? What has the consequence been for that society and those people, especially with the knowledge that there's ghost schools, there's ghost police, there's this corruption? How does that register with the Afghani citizens?
Well, let me share with you my own feelings of what the first 20 years of the wars were. These were wars essentially fought against the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, and then proxy wars of the regional community. And the consequence of that essentially is it has been sometimes said, bombing the country back into the Stone Ages. And that's what had happened. And then came the U.S. intervention. There was enormous hope.
That would be, we're talking late 80s, early 90s?
No, 2001, I'm talking
2001,
about. So
okay.
1980s, 1990s. 1980s were the wars against the communism until 92. 92 then on became the Civil War, which brought the Taliban into the picture until 2001, the formation of Al-Qaeda and all the rest. And then 2001, when America intervened with NATO, I went back to Afghanistan after quite many years. I had not been in the country actually till last I was in the country was 1996. Before that, from 1975 to 96, I had not been in the country for 21 years. And 1 month after I was in Afghanistan, the Taliban came and took the Kabul at that point. But then I went back in 2002. In 2002, the enthusiasm and hopes and expectation of the people of Afghanistan from America, having come and intervened and liberated them from Taliban, was palpable. People had so much trust in America at that point. We squandered it, slowly and gradually. What happened, of course, was that they thought we were going to build a democratic government. And we essentially introduced a bunch of kleptocrats. The head of government is part of the government. And people immediately gradually saw, and one thing that we have to remember is for the first 4 years after our intervention, there was no resistance against the United States. We fished around for these terrorists and Al-Qaeda, this and, piddled here, piddled there, for whatever reason nobody really knows. There was no fighting in the country. We were probably the only ones who went occasionally and busted, some poor people's homes and got a few people and sent them to Guantanamo. But other than that, there was not much. So it took Taliban 4 or 5 years to organize themselves. And then their evidence for being able to mobilize people for their war was, look what America has done to our country. Is this the government you think is democratic? Is this the democracy? This is still what they're talking about. So given that kleptocracy that became pervasive in the country, it gave all the reasons for people to get away. So initially, again, there was a lot of trust in America, in Americans being able to help us. Then there was disillusionment. Gradual disillusionment. And I think by this time it has turned into hatred. And it's very sad that a country and a population who were willing to give so much trust and willing to be, partners, good partners, we essentially squandered that because of our policies that were not honest. And we did not really do Afghans much of a favor, unfortunately.
It seems almost that Afghanistan was a pawn in a larger geopolitical strategy, like Ronald Reagan and the support to the jihadists or the Islamists that did not really, although they were fighting the Soviets, they weren't organized on the level that the U.S. Created that organization, which actually did give sustenance to groups like Al-Qaeda and others. Later, the U.S. wants to make its distance, but that must have been, on some level, the Afghan people must have been aware of that.
I'm glad
well.
you brought that up. What happened in the 1980s was in Afghan genuine popular resistance against communism and against Soviet Union. What instead of being supported is a war of liberation. And it was motivated by Islam, by religion, no doubt about it, because of a communist, atheist regime that had come. So it made sense at that level for people to mobilize people against that regime on religious grounds. But it was also a war of liberation. And instead of doing that, what we did, in fact, very purposefully, as I indicated, particularly on that account of Count de Menarche, the head of intelligence of France, in his book, The Fourth World War and Espionage in the Age of or Era of Terrorism. He lays out very barely that we went there, or he proposed to President Reagan at the time, that Afghanistan should be the focus of his foreign policy.
It's the way to oppose the Soviet Union at the
Yes,
time.
and to engage in the Cold War and turn that war into essentially part of the Third World War, as he calls it, and turn the Mujahideen into essentially a Cold Warriors. And the scheme that he had proposed to Reagan was that first you have to do something about drugs. That he asked if what did they do when FBI and others confiscated drugs. So we'll burn them, destroy them. So don't do it. Send it to the war front. And now we know why in wars that we have been engaged, there's been always this drug cartel there. It was in Southeast Asia and it became in Afghanistan, so that their enemy will get these free drugs and will use them and will become addicted. And also the production of that narcotics in the country itself has multiplied and also has essentially produced 3.5 million Afghans who are now addicted to the same problem. The other part was the religious one, that he was saying that in France, a small group was printing Bibles in Russian language, and they were distributing it so that it had to be funded in larger scale and larger introduction. And on top of that, they had to build madrasas, Muslim seminaries in Pakistan, and they have built in the tune of today, registered ones are said to be 45,000. And they became essentially factories for production of Taliban. And Taliban are no other than these extremists.
It's almost as if the U.S. Strategic orientation was, we will produce the people that can then be the military target.
Exactly.
You produce these, obviously at the beginning it may be against Soviets, but at the end it's somebody that you can say, define as terrorists, but it's the result of policies that have gone before. So.
Absolutely. It was a collaborative effort, according to Count de Monarchet, that the French idea, and French apparently were the ones, it was kept secret. He says for 11 years that he had been the head of the French intelligence service, that it was kept as a secret. And a lot of people were, in fact, thinking that this was something that CIA had done. In fact, the idea was not from the CIA. In fact, he talks very negatively about CIA.
But recent accounts have revealed that the CIA participated in this willingly. It may not have been their original idea, but they were certainly the operatives.
The money that did these projects were U.S. taxpayers' money.
The other thing I understand, and this may not be accurate, but I understand that a good share of the budgeting for the Ghani government was foreign aid, foreign assistance. It wasn't like Afghanistan had a vibrant economy that was able to produce goods that could be traded, but it rested largely on international aid of one sort or another. And if the U.S. withdraws, all of that aid goes away. There's sanctions that are put, so whatever problems that were being faced by whatever government followed have been really increased, and the effect will be serious on the daily life of the Afghanis that remain.
Exactly. The Afghan governments have been dependent on foreign aid, both money, military wear, and everything, since 1880, when it was created as a buffer nation state. And this last phase is not new.
Yeah.
Even in the good times, when there was no war in Afghanistan, up to 60-70% of the government budget was foreign aid. So yes, this is a very serious matter that the United States now has frozen the assets that belong supposedly, or at least it was named for the people of Afghanistan. And that we are in a tough spot, because if you give this money to Taliban, then Taliban will use it as they wish, and they will claim legitimacy, and they will supposedly claim service. So the international community needs to do something, and that something is that they have to find a way to help the people of Afghanistan, provide them basic services and food particularly, because this winter you may experience a serious a tragedy in Afghanistan. So they have to find a way through the United Nations and international community relief organizations, help to the people who need it in Afghanistan and not wait for Taliban, because otherwise those who will suffer will be the people of Afghanistan. One thing that most people don't know is Taliban are not capable of feeding themselves. They feed themselves off of the people.
The Taliban will be one organized instance of resistance to the U.S. presence. At the same time, as you said, there's an undercurrent of opposition that started with trust. It ends up with distrust, and at a certain point even ends up with dislike or hatred. My question is, and you raise it in some of your writings, is that in the West it's presented as if Islam is the source of terrorism. And you have suggested that the source of terrorism is more political, it's more historical, it's linked to the larger resistance. We don't have a lot of time left, but I thought we could end with that particular observation that you've made, that it's not Islam per se, but it's the resistance that somehow comes from the political and historical context, including the colonial states that have been established. So,
well, you see, in 9/11, we had the option of presenting this accurately, what this problem was. We could have presented in ways that war would not have been necessary. One way of conceiving it would have been that it is a social malfeasance.
yes,
It's a social problem, a social disease, a medical one.
yes,
In that case, you don't go to war. You treat it and use diagnosticians and come up with proper solution. The other one is that this is a commodity that people make money out of.
yes,
And when you have a commodity has producers and consumers. So if we had looked at why 15 or 16 of the people on those planes were Saudi citizens, middle class and so forth, we would have said, what in Saudi Arabia produces people like them? We didn't want that because that implicates us. And the other possibility, of course, was that this is, in its essence, a political problem that terrorism produced in political environments where people are either occupied, such as in Palestine, the Israelis, or Russians in Chechnya and other places, or border disputes, places like Kashmir between Pakistan and
even when you're saying that, it makes me think that the very definition of terrorism has to be applied to somebody, because
Indeed.
in some cases you could argue that there's freedom fighters in Palestine, or there's freedom fighters in Chechnya, and I mean, Reagan even used that term in Nicaragua.
This is a methodology anyway. Terrorism is a method, but the reason is something else. That's what I'm saying, that the reason could be is political in all these instances. All these modern nation states with multiple ethnic communities put together, in discrimination and abuse and bias, being practiced daily, and the regimes being supported by the West militarily and providing them weapons of, torture and abuse.
Which can aggravate the ethnic differences, the tribal differences, in fact, foment those as part of the intent.
Right. If we had presented this as a political problem, political problems have solutions. But we presented it as a religious problem, purposefully, intently, made it an Islamic problem. When you problematize things in terms of religion, you don't expect solutions. You don't expect solutions, and because there are none.
Especially if your solution is military.
Exactly.
As opposed to a theological conversation or social. But this is a problem that can't be surmounted because these people are irrational. They don't believe as we do. Therefore, the only way we can deal with them
Islamophobia, essentially. The production is Islamophobia, and Islamophobia is what we have at this time at hand, and we are basically stuck with it because we misdiagnosed purposefully the problem and represented it only as a security problem, nothing else. So when you make things a security problem, it emotionally is supportive by the population, and that's what we
one
did.
thing we might draw from that is other things that happen since Afghanistan, even since August, is also being presented as security problems, as opposed to
Virtually
political
everything,
problems,
that's
cultural
right.
problems.
Yes,
And that's
right.
one lesson that I get from your writings and also from our interview. We could go on, obviously, but that's all the time we have for on our program. Thank you, Dr. Shahrani, for joining me today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. See you next time.